two chapters we were interested in were education, because we feel that we need to educate people about issues. And the second was about housing, because next month we're doing Code Next. And if we don't know anything about how housing developed in Austin over the decades, right, it will be very difficult for us to be able to appreciate what Code Next is proposing. Okay? The other thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that there's an interactive map article that the American Statesman put together, and I put the URL up here. It's projects.statesman.com/, I guess it is, news, racial, geography. And it goes through the decades, beginning, I think it's like in the early 1900s, and goes decade by decade and gives you interactive maps that where you can actually trace the movement of people in the city of Austin. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. We are also going to tape the introductory remarks today. We will put them on our website, and I will put on the website a link to that particular article. And for those of you who came early, I will also put on the website a graph that shows the state's contribution to public education and property tax rate, and how they go like this, right? If the state's contribution decreases, our property taxes increase. So that would give you some sort of basis for the description or the underlying some of the information that we might need in talking about public education. And Dr. Cruz will be here shortly. Yes.
I just wanted to ask if anyone has an empty seat next to them.
I don't. Oh, I think there's one. Thank you for asking. There's one right here. We've got all the chairs out at this point. Oh, and there's one up here. That's right, because he's moved. So, feel free to come around. But come around this way, right? Because otherwise we've got a problem. So, without further ado, I'm going to, two more announcements that I'm always supposed to make. One is that one of the things that is important for us is civil discourse. So we want to make sure that we respect everyone's point of view that is in the audience and at our panel. And the other is that we are a nonprofit with no dues. And if you like what you hear and like what you see, there's a little cup over there. And you like the coffee that you drink, right? We'd appreciate a donation. If you are interested in the things that we do and you would like to be a board member, I'd like to talk to you. So, without further ado, then let me introduce Mike Ignikowski, who has served as our moderator for quite a few panel conversations this far. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Joanna. I want to welcome everyone here today on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. My name is Mike Ignikowski, and I'll moderate a panel discussion. For your convenience, we scheduled this more or less in between the natural disasters. So you can still go home tonight and see the next phase of the apocalypse live on TV. I'll be moderating a panel discussion today on the recent Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism and Systemic Inequities. We're going to have three panel members here. Dr. Cruz has been delayed in traffic. Now, I'll introduce them in a moment, but first let me give you some background information about the task force and a little bit about the history of Austin. So it was actually last November, Austin Mayor Steve Adler announced the formation of the task force to address institutional racism in Austin. The task force was comprised of several local representatives from business and education and criminal justice, and they formed about 5 different work groups. These were education, real estate and housing, health, finance, banking and industry, and civil and criminal justice. And today we're going to focus mainly on the first 2 of those, education and housing, 2 of the big topics here. Mayor Adler asked two people to lead the effort, Dr. Colette Pierce-Burnett, she's Houston Tillotson University president, and Dr. Paul Cruz, who will be here momentarily. He's the Austin ISD superintendent. They worked with over 200 community members. Collectively, they developed about 200 recommendations out of this task force. The final report was given to the Austin City Council on April 6th of this year. The full 71-page report is available online. Just do a search on the Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism, and you'll find links to it, plus a bunch of local news articles on it. All interesting reading. I want to quote some surprising statistics from that report. In 2014, Austin topped the list of the most economically segregated large metropolitan areas in the United States. I'm just doing a little bit of introduction. Let you catch your breath.
Sorry, I was trying to be discreet, but I don't think I've been successful in that. Sorry.
So Austin was the most economically segregated large metropolitan area in the United States. This means Austin is the place where you are least likely to find working class people living within proximity of upper middle class folks. Austin is also found to be the most racially segregated large metropolitan area in the United States. Economic and racial segregation have resulted in a city that is actually quite separate and profoundly unequal. The poorer areas do have under-resourced schools, fewer health care places, fewer transportation options, and fewer environmental protections. So how do we get to be in this place? So just south of the black communities, the effort was less formalized, but more or less just as effective. The Hispanic area goes from roughly 10th Street down to the banks of the Colorado River, and both of these are just east of what we now know as I-35. By the way, this is one of the few cases where we have I-35 being discussed that has nothing to do with traffic backups. In recent years, Austin has become a destination city. Which means those who move here from other parts of the country at a rapid clip generally have a high level of income. They raise the housing prices and subsequently the property taxes, especially in the attractive areas closer to the urban core. In turn, a lot of the long-standing residents, especially those with modest means, can no longer afford to live near the heart of the city. They are displaced, pushed out to outlying areas in a well-known process of gentrification. According to one article I read, in fact, there are sections of East Austin known today as the hippest hipster neighborhoods in the country. So that's where we are today. And I want to now turn this over to our three panel members. We've asked each of them to talk about 10 minutes or so and give us some of their insights and thoughts on this task force and where Austin moves from this point on. And then we'll open it up to general group discussions. As we keep trickling in, I see more and more of the crowd standing in the back. I do want to compliment those of you who had the foresight to arrive early enough to actually find a parking spot. That always helps. So, without further ado, who would like to start?
Did I go first?
We all agree with you.
I want to apologize for being so late. I was actually on time, but of course with traffic and a couple of accidents on Mopac, but everything was okay I think for folks, but sort of fender benders, and so that's really, I didn't account for that. I should have, but I didn't, so I apologize. I was not at the UT game. So I'm sure I was not there. I wanted to be here. And thank you all so much. I mean, we never know how many people to expect when we do these sessions. But this is really quite nice to see the number of people here to engage in this type of dialogue. So as superintendent of the district, just a little bit on Austin ISD. It's around 83,000 students in Austin ISD, 130 campuses. It's $1 billion budget. We employ about 12,000 individuals to work in the school system. Our main mission is about educating all kids. I firmly believe as a superintendent, as a teacher, and also as a father, that all kids need an equal life chance, every single one. And for us, that's around 83,000 students who walk through our classrooms every single day. And we have Oh, sorry.
Want to make an announcement, there's a blue Honda that's being towed, if it's one of yours, please go up.
Cry 9363. Cry 9363.
Don't walk, run.
Sorry.
Mine will be the next car, so I better talk fast and go move my car, because Ashton said it was okay, but I don't know, Ashton, you hope you got my back there. So just a little bit, that's just around the school system. It is about reinventing the urban school experience. Really, when I look at that, and certainly there's a lot of complexities in a school system such as Austin ISD. As we're the 6th largest district in the state of Texas, there are over 1,200 districts in the state of Texas. We're number 6. We're the 4th largest, I think, around the 4th largest employer here in the city. So it's a large, dynamic organization with our main mission around educating all kids, making sure they have an equal life chance. When I look at performance and say, well, so where are we on that trajectory? So what are we doing? So when I look at student outcomes, that's extremely important to look at outcomes. There are many, many different ways to look at having an equal life chance. My main thing is about, are kids ready for college, career, and life? Yes, there's a lot of other complexity in the school system. I totally get it. I've done this for quite a while, but our thing is about making sure kids graduate on time. So at one point, we had our graduation rate in the mid-70s. So for a student, and that's overall, of our district that is 70% minority. We're also a district of 60% poverty. So poverty in Austin ISD is not in any one area, it really is in multiple areas of the city. I will also say that the way the city changes, Austin ISD changes. There are some districts that have a little chunk of Austin, like Round Rock or Pflugerville or Leander. For Austin, we are Austin. So the way the city changed, our demographics are also going to change. So performance-wise, and reinventing the urban school experience, we set a goal of realizing a 90% graduation rate. We're in about the mid-70s at that point as a district, with 60% students who are Hispanic or Latino, and 10%, 9% African American. So when we look at about midpoint of 75% or so as a district, when you look at then performance of Latino students or black students, it was actually lower than that. For a student who was a Latino male or a black male, it's even lower than that. So we're going into the 60s. So we set that expectation around about 2000 for the class of 2009. Fast forward today, our graduation rate coming from the mid-70s is now at a 90.7% for the class of 2016. Our graduation rate lags 1 year behind because just because students graduate in May, we also have summer school. So I actually do not have the rate for 2017, our most recent graduating class, but for 2016, it's 90.7%. Making the most significant improvements in our graduation rate, it's for Hispanic students, black students, and English language learners across the board when I look at longitudinal. I also say, well, we clap for that, that's okay, yeah, I can do that. To me, that means equity. It is what it is, and these are data points that are consistent across the state and also the country. So at a 90.7%, and I just mentioned about student groups and which ones have made the most significant improvement, I will also say that that percentage, where there are other sort of rates out there around an annualized dropout rate or an annualized rate for just one class or whatever, this is a longitudinal graduation rate. So it's the percent of students who enter as freshmen and actually graduate 4 years later. So that's it's a strict definition, even over a harder definition than the more rigorous in the state's definition. I will also say, as an urban school system, we're also above the state average on our graduation rate. That was not the case in 2009. We were well below the state average. So through considered effort from teachers, principals, a very strong focus, because to get a student to graduate from high school, not only does the student have to demonstrate proficiency on academic readiness, but there's a socialization piece. And that's where I do feel that the work with the mayor's task force brought out other issues that we've been working through in Austin ISD over time, and that's a socialization piece. So when a student is academically ready, but is also a student of color, and individuals may not perceive those students as actually being successful or that they even belong. And as an adult, you can sort of handle that, and you can sort of work through that, but it's pretty tough when you're 6, 7 years old, 14, 12, and you're actually depending on adults to make sure that you graduate from high school on time. Those are the types of issues that I think in this report really brought that out to the forefront about implicit bias. And what is it, and in our situation, sort of like the whole focal point on improving graduation rate, when we looked at students who were suspended for discretionary reasons, we saw similar behaviors, but for one student, it's like, oh, okay, well, they're just sort of messing around, let them go, and we'll go on back to class. For other students, it's like, I feel unsafe now. You're out of here, you're suspended, you're removed to another center. That was really hard for me to look at our data, and it was hard for our principals. Because I do love this district. I love Austin. I've lived here many, many years off and on. I love this place. That's a really hard data point to look at and say, why is that? I'm not saying anything this, that, the other, but having those conversations with our teachers and our principals and our parents and letting them know and say, does this help us realize the vision of reinventing the urban school experience when we have higher removal rates for students of color? Our answer was no, it doesn't. So then we have to go about, get busy and do something about that. So by doing that, we've actually reduced the number of discretionary removals from classrooms, a lot of discussions with teachers and principals on how to work with students so that we de-escalate behavior and not escalate behavior for many different reasons. One example, these are the things that type of happen that sort of implicit bias, and just tell me how much, if I have 1 more minute, just let me know. 3, okay. As an example, when I visit schools, and example that I saw once is one student, pants were sagged, they were just sort of sagging, you know what I mean? The pants were down and had a cap on and was walking by me, and one of the adults said, hey, pick up your pants and take off your cap. And the kid just kept walking. And then the individual, the adult, said it again, takes after the student, and now we're going to have a suspension, a removal, here we go, all this other stuff, and the student's going to miss instruction. Then to another situation that I experienced. Same situation, walking down, visiting the hallways and in and out of classrooms. A student comes by, was wearing a cap, shouldn't have been wearing a cap. The individual says, the adult says, hey, remove your cap. You're making me look really bad here in front of my boss. And then the student just says, all right, sir, takes it off, moves on down the line, goes to class, and we're good. But that's a way to de-escalate behavior and not to escalate behavior. And then bring in other situations that are really not going to be helpful. They're very punitive, and I don't know that students really learn from that. And I think it's important, again, when we look at these things, is being honest about it. And the report really brought that to the forefront. We also conducted an equity study. Part of this is what we asked for institutions is to conduct an equity study. We did it in 3 areas. We looked at our graduation rate, we looked at our suspension rates, and we looked at access to rigorous programs. We looked to see how many students, Black and Hispanic, are enrolled in magnet schools. How many students are actually taking advanced coursework in pre-AP or AP courses or enrolled in GT programs.
What do those mean?
Advancement courses, if a student takes that course and passes the test, they get college credit. Gifted and talented program, there are different types of giftedness, so we can enroll students in those programs. We look to see in some schools where there are very, very few Black and Hispanic kids. But it's again, bringing out the data and saying, well, why is that? From the work, and I think really the work with the Mayor's Task Force really pushed us in this direction. We've actually then increased the number of Black Hispanic students in our magnet schools. This is our first year we're doing it. A lot of people said, yeah, it's not gonna happen, but it's gotta be very intentional. It has to be very intentional, and even though it hasn't happened in the past, it doesn't mean we can't change things and make it different for the future. And so having more students in GT programs as well. Just different examples of how we took the Mayor's Task Force into education, but obviously there were other areas around health, affordability, housing, and the criminal justice system that I know all my co-panelists will also get into. I just wanted to go deep on the educational piece to it.
Thank you very much. As I said, we'll open it up to questions and comments after all 3 panel members. So, I appreciate your enthusiasm about say it. Who's going to go next? Okay. So Dr. Kisuke Prince is a program manager for the Mayor's Task Force and a senior policy advisor and education coordinator for Mayor Adler's office in that capacity. He co-developed, implemented long-range strategic plans for community-focused economic growth, shedding light on neglected neighborhoods, as well as identifying ways to advance equity and the alignment of resources in education. In 2014, Dr. Prince was a candidate for the at-large position 9 of the Austin School Board. Dr. Prince.
I think one of the things I want to highlight in some of my comments is some of the motivation of why we did the task force. Now, the task force is part of a larger initiative called the Spirit of East Austin, which was started more than 2 years ago. And the Spirit of East Austin was, in real simple terms, was an attempt on the...
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Cool. It was an attempt on the mayor's part, along in partnership with the former city manager and the current city manager, the Face East. As you may be well aware of, East Austin had a history of neglect and kind of being treated as an invisible part of the community. And as we've dealt with gentrification in East Austin, the question is, how do we face East in such a way that we are respecting the culture, the community, the history of East Austin? And so that's what the Spirit of East Austin was all about. But one of the things that has come up on a number of occasions throughout our history is this issue around racism, and particularly institutional racism. And there were 2 incidents that you may recall that happened. Well, one happened 2 years ago, one happened last year. If you recall, there was a young man who was shot by the police. He was African American. He was a boy, 17 years old, who was shot by a police officer. He was nude and running and was shot and killed. His name was David Joseph, thank you. And then we also had a video that was from actually a previous summer, but was came out last summer. Her name is escaping me now. Breon King. And if you remember that video, she was body slammed by a police officer for a situation. A lot of people's perception was that it could have been de-escalated. And then when she was in the car, she was told by the police officer, who was another police officer, well, you know, African Americans are just inherently dangerous. And so those incidents, in part, in some way, created this conversation about what do we do about our police department and dealing with issues of racism. But then it became a larger conversation about how do we not just focus on the police department, but how do we focus on criminal and civil justice issues. And then it became a conversation about housing, education, and one of the things we all were quite clearly aware of is that this issue of institutional racism, it pervades our entire society. And if that's the case, then we need to bring our partners together to figure out what are we going to do about it. The great thing about it, and the reason why the mayor, we were a little scared when this happened, but he says, yeah, I'm going to give you 6 months. Now, as y'all know, if you follow city politics, nothing happens in 6 months. And so the mayor put it upon, after inviting Dr. Cruz and Dr. Pierce Burnett to lead the coalition. We initially brought together about 60 individuals from across the communities and who have different expertise areas, and then we came up with the 5 different subgroups. The intention there was to figure out, to acknowledge that we're not here to call individuals racist, but fundamentally we have some systems in place across our community that has resulted in some of the biases and disparities that we're clearly aware of. We may not have been here back in 1928 when they segregated the city and said if you're African American and you want to live on the west side of what wasn't in existence yet, I-35, we're going to take all your city services, and if you want to receive those, you need to move to East Austin. That's what basically creating the Negro District was about. And then they reaffirmed it back in 1957. So you may not have been here when that happened, but you have a certain responsibility to figure out what are we going to do as a community to not just reverse it, but to really make a difference in people's lives. Because you can reverse something, but you actually have to do extra work. And the equity is not about just making things equal. It's saying to your community and saying, you know, there's folks here who really have not received certain resources, opportunities. We need to pour our resources, our time, our energy, our policies, our programs in this community, so there is a really more of an equal playing field. And so when you saw, and as was mentioned before, over 200 recommendations, because these are ideas that people had already been talking about. I'm a consultant, I focus on diversity and inclusion. You don't have to always ask people what to do. The question is, when we're gonna do it, and how we're gonna find money to pay for it. And so the great thing about having that 6-month limitation was it gave license for Dr. Cruz and Dr. Burnett and us and along with Ashton to say, nope, no, there's no extension of the deadline. No, the deadline is here. No, and it was almost a culture of no in a positive way, because what people wanted to do is extend the deadline, because there's no way we can complete this if in the deadline that we have, when the truth, and what we need to be the truth, is that there was already great ideas out there. We had people, over 200 people who were like, we need to do this, and do that. One of the challenges we ran into is that if you look at the report, not all the ideas, all the recommendations jive together. And that was intentional, because what the mayor wanted was all what we thought were the good ideas. We didn't all have to agree on them. We didn't have to vote on them and say, okay, we agree on this one or that one. We just said, these are what we believe to be the good ideas. Now that we're going to put them out there, we want to hear the community's feedback and ideas about what we think are good ideas. If there's an idea that you think maybe should have been on there, it wasn't, we want to hear those ideas as well. But part of the challenge that I think as we get into some of our conversation later on is that as we talk about our next steps, we have over 200 recommendations, great. But now as we're kind of really trying to look at the next steps, part of it is making sure as a team and as a community, we're on the same page. We have a common language. Do we have a common lens to look at the challenges that are facing us? Because part of the challenges that I know as a consultant is that if I have one person who's here who looks at race kind of, the way I think about cultural competency or dealing with race issues is kind of like being a wine connoisseur. If you're like myself, I'm not very sophisticated in my consumption of wine. There's usually about 4 categories. There's red, there's white, there's sweet, like Kool-Aid, right? And then there's the bitter, right? And as an unsophisticated consumer of wine, those are my 4 categories of wine. And when we think about racism, oftentimes when people think about race and racism, they kind of think about it in real simple terms. And you have some folks who are really sophisticated around wine. And I'm only beginning my sophistication in wine, but what I have learned is that, depending on where the wine comes from, there's a certain name that goes with it. When you take the glass and you go like this, there's these things called legs. Has anyone heard that? Yeah, I don't know, it doesn't walk away, so I'm not sure what it's called. But they do like this, and it's called legs, and they can go into the history and tell you about the vines and the nuns and the priests who grew it. You're just like, oh my God, it's too much information. But for someone who's dealing with issues around race and racism, the sophistication and the nuances and the deep diving is like that in the same way. And so what we're talking about when we talk about building people's cultural competency or racial fluency is helping them get to a point where they really understand and are able to dig deep into these issues of racism, because it's not simple. This is emotional. This is not just a simple coming up with the right policy. These are people's emotions that are associated. People are going to be angry and enraged about things. They're going to be feeling hurt and guilty and ashamed. If you don't have the skills to be able to dig deep and really kind of navigate those situations as leading this type of initiative, you're going to run into the same problems we run into over and over and over. Remember affirmative action when it came out during the 60s? I wasn't born, but I hope some of y'all remember. And there was a lot of challenges that arose. You had people who weren't qualified for the position, and they understood, well, they're not qualified for the position, and then you get all upset. They're now hiring unqualified people for this job. It wasn't about whether they're qualified or not. It's bringing people with certain insights and abilities that oftentimes are being ignored. But because of those challenges, people had a lot of negative feelings about affirmative action. When we really were missing kind of the point of it, was how do you bring all these different people from different backgrounds, whether it be if you're a woman, if you're from different racial or ethnic background, how do I bring my talents and skills to the table and see them as valued? Because oftentimes you bring certain insights and perspectives that, well, that's really not important. Well, actually it is. And we've learned this not just within our own states and our cities and our country. We've learned this as we've gone abroad globally. And so how do we make sure that we're going about this work in a way that really brings people to the table and makes the best opportunity so we can all really benefit from the prosperity we experience here in the city of Austin. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you. One more panel member, then we'll get to your questions. So Alba Sereno is also a program manager of the Mayor's Task Force and has served as adjunct faculty lecturing on social justice, community organizing, community development at both UT and St. Edward's University. She's a policy advisor to Council Member Allison Alter, District 10, and formerly served as the vice chair of the Austin Commission on Immigrant Affairs. She's a volunteer facilitator for the One Human Race Initiative. Alba.
So, my name is Alba Sereno. I will quickly tell you that I am a transnational person. That means that parts of my family were here in Texas before there were real borders. And so we lived a bicultural existence across my family. Louder, right?
Yes. Competing with air conditioning.
Competing with air conditioning, okay. And so in my experience, growing up as a transnational person, in my generation, my family came back to the United States, right? And we had interesting experiences, my sibling and I, at an early age, that were little tells about a system of structural institutional racism from the time that we got here. One of the earliest experiences that I remember of thinking, something interesting is going on here, was at my elementary school. This was on the US-Mexico border in the Rio Grande Valley. And I remember being like, okay, it's kindergarten, awesome. I am in the ESL classroom. I don't know what that means because I actually don't know a lot of English, but I spoke a little bit and Spanish and also some French. And we're walking as kids do in a line, and kids from other classrooms knew the classroom that we were walking to because it was labeled ESL. And so the children in the other classrooms started to yell things like wetback and other interesting terms. And I thought to myself, but those kids, they look exactly like me. So what's going on here, right? My family, my parents had grown up in poverty in Mexico, and in their generation had climbed up quite a bit. So they became doctors in Mexico, but when we came back to the United States, they weren't able to practice. So we set up small businesses in the US. My parents had really small businesses. And any family business, as many of you know, you do all of it, right? So we would travel across the state coming through our Texas capital, and we could see the differences in the city, just what the different neighborhoods look like. And I always had this kind of question in my mind about why things were structured that way. And I could see across all of those years, doing child labor for my family business, that it was real, that on either side of the highway there were really stark differences. And I thought that's really interesting because in my small town on the border, we have a railroad track and there are really stark differences, right? And then I had the border, which obviously I could see some really stark differences in too. So I went off and got an education, and then eventually I decided to get more education, and I came to UT and was working on a master's degree in social work, and I began to really dig into those childhood questions about those differences in this particular community. And that journey taught me about language that I could use to describe those differences and what was going on with those differences. And so for some of you, it's okay if you are thinking, well, what is institutional racism? I have heard of racists. I don't want to be called a racist. Is this task force calling me a racist, right? I've been part of this community, I've been living in this reality. Does that mean that I am the problem? And the truth is that racism in this country is our groundwater truth. The groundwater seeps into everything, and it is feeding into all of our systems. And such is racism in this country. Institutional racism means that we have social structures in place that are institutionalized in the way that we do our daily work, our daily business, our daily lives. And yes, we are all complicit in that. Even me, the child of a transnational family, who would be in a different part of a structure of privilege than many of you in this room. Even I am complicit in that. Because there are people below me on the hierarchy that structural racism builds out for us, which I could exercise power inadvertently or overtly over. So I got invited, not voluntold, invited, right? To work on the task force by Mr. Ashton Cumberbatch, which is hiding somewhere in the back. and I'm really grateful for that, because at the time I was doing deep community organizing in South and Southeast Austin, and in my daily work I saw the absolute differences in people's health outcomes and people's life outcomes, and they were just more examples, you know, that would complement what I had as my early experience and what I had studied about. And so it was real life and in front of me, and we were interfacing with the city and calling for some of that equitable investment that Dr. Prince talked about and that Dr. Cruz talked about. And I was deep in it with people, and then I got a call that said, hey, do you want to work on this? And I said, absolutely, but I also thought, uh-oh, what am I getting into, right? What is this? And so I was invited to the conversation to shape what this was. And what we tried to shape, as Dr. Prince was talking about, was an exercise to create an official document from the city that would allow us to have an official document that says we admit that structural racism and systemic inequities exist in our history, exist in our current existence, right? And that we have to do something about them. As a community organizer, that was tremendously attractive to me, because in my heart of hearts, I wanted something to hold on to hold the city accountable to. And I realized that unless we explicitly have these admissions and explicitly name that there are things to do about these things, we can't move on with the business about doing them. In 2015, two Harvard economists completed a study across the country. They looked at 5 million families, and they looked at county and zip code data. And they came up with 5 indicators of what predicts mobility, people's life outcomes of success in our country. One of the 5 indicators that they discovered was to live in diverse communities. So out of all the hundreds of things in your life that could happen, that could shape where you get to in life, your health outcomes, your income mobility outcomes, your reach for education, your reach for having a retirement, you know, all of these different life outcomes. Living in diverse neighborhoods was one of the top 5 indicators. And then all of the other indicators were about access to education, the financial system, etc. And guess what? Those things are all interrelated. Because we have the groundwater truth of racism. When we look at people's life outcomes and statistics, we may be tempted to say, poverty is a real problem, you know, this other thing is a real problem, etc. But the one marker that determines outcomes for groups of people again and again and again, the one thing that you can use as a proxy is your racial and ethnic identity marker. There is no other thing. And we see over and over and over again in the data. In health, who comes on top and who comes at the bottom? You put race in as the proxy, and it'll tell you in health, in education, in the financial system, in housing, etc., in criminal justice, etc., right? So we have no room for denial anymore. We do have room for action. And the question that we get about what comes next is action. What comes next is organizing. What comes next is accountability. What comes next is self-education. So we invite you to read the report. We invite you to take whatever steps back you need to take. If you need to take steps back to catch up to the conversation, right, about why this is the marker, this is the problem, and this is what we need to do something about. And then we invite you to engage steps forward with us as we take on the journey of implementing these things, which is not easy, because in a system of institutional racism, we are rewarded for acting transactionally. What does that mean? It means that we are rewarded for exercising our power and coming on top. In our individual decisions at every moment, in every interaction, in our policy decisions, in how we do it. The easier road is not to work on these complex things. The easier road is just to seek benefit for ourselves and those who are like us at every decision. So this is a journey that we must go hand in hand in. No one elected official, no one appointed official, no one person of color can do it alone. And so there has to be a progression to working together in collaboration as human beings on these things. We will falter. I am sure that there has been faltering since we released this report, right? But what encourages me is that the day that we released the report to council, Dr. Cruz and Dr. Colette Pierce Burnett, came to council and they presented to the report. And that same day on council agenda for discussion was a housing master plan. And several of the council members rose their hands up when the discussion on the housing master plan was about to happen. This is recorded, right? You can see it. And they said, hey, we need to talk about this housing section in the report. And we can't move forward with that housing master plan, which later got renamed a blueprint, unless we include some of those recommendations on housing. Even the ones that we knew that the state was already preventing the city from putting an actual implementation. And even though they knew that putting it explicitly into a plan of the city or a blueprint of the city or a roadmap of the city would mean more repercussions and more backlash at the state level. And they voted and they included some of those recommendations. And then one of the council members, who I hear is coming to your next meeting, said, from this day forward, we can't do anything else in the city without having this lens. And that comment was not so much about any of the individual specific recommendations in this report. It was about having that lens of that groundwater truth. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I want to thank all our panel members for their insights there. This is the time where we open it up to audience questions. Let me tell you how this is going to work first.
Some ground rules.
Ground rules. I'm going to pick people jumping around so there's no geographic disparity here in the room. Do the best I can. I ask you to keep your questions brief. We will entertain a comment as long as it's brief, and we'll entertain one follow-on question if you have it. The one thing we really try to avoid is back and forth argument between one person and a panel member, because we really want to open up the time for everyone to talk. So I will start with the person who raised their hand first.
Dr. Cruz, and thank you for being here today. I noticed the color of your shirt. I have difficulty when there are charges that, as an institution, that the school district is racist, even current charges. And I need an answer for people when they claim that the bond proposition is being racist. I have dealt with a district when I have seen what I believe to be deliberate and constant racism. I have also seen where our district has moved away from that. And I advocated for a Latino or Latina for our next superintendent. And I'm glad that you're here, because not only are you from Texas, you're of Texas. And I was glad to see you receive the position that you did. But as an institution, as I said, I don't understand the district is racist. And I don't understand having to constantly pay for the sins of the past. Thank you.
Okay. So, in response, I'm going to sort of look at it from two different areas. One is with the report, it is addressing institutional racism across all different sectors and how it's interrelated. So it's not any one entity, it's not any one area, it's multiple. With Austin ISD, and I probably started off too much on AISD, but I mean, it's always on my mind, right? So it's sort of like that country western song, always on my mind. That we have the lens of performance. So I go through the example around a graduation rate, because where things are said, performance is not equal, it's true, it wasn't. Even today, there are some areas we're not hitting on all cylinders, but on a biggie, we are. And on other indicators, we are as well. So I'd always go back to, where's the data point? I mean, as one thing, is the way I address different questions. I want to be real about things. I want to put it on the table. We have to have these really hard discussions to get better. That is important, and we're going to come from a different perspective. So when I look at equal or equality, I look at performance across the board. That's my first point. So where are the kids? I know the adults, we have to sort of always work through issues. That's any organization, that's just the way it is. But where's performance, and what do we need to do there around student learning? The second thing I will just sort of talk about, AISD is the largest district in Central Texas. This included, first of all, multiple school districts. So Manor was a part of it, Del Valle was a part of it. We actually presented to all the area superintendents in the Central Texas area. But it was also about higher education. So Dr. Rhodes was also part of the discussion. So was Greg Fenvis, and also somebody from his office. Because even if a student from Del Valle finishes high school, is college ready, is then the next level of the institution going to be prepared for that individual student? Or if the student graduates from Leander or Round Rock, whatever that is, what about when they try to get a job? What are the access points at those times? That's why this report was not about any one entity. It was about an area of education, but it also looked at education, healthcare, affordability, the criminal justice system. So it looked at sort of financial positioning. It looked at multiple areas. That's where the systemic piece comes in, because implicit bias or institutional racism can be found in all of those and a combination thereof. So I'd always want to make sure we keep it at that lens, because I think if we just go too simplistic, we're really missing it. We're going to miss the boat, and really we're not going to get any better. It really we have to deal with the complexity of it to truly understand and make a difference on an institutional issue as we have in this report.
If I just add real something, not about the district specific, but when you're dealing with institutional racism, one of the first things that comes up is that, well, I'm a good person, I must not be racist. And being a good person has nothing to do with being a good person. If anything, they're two separate issues. There's a lot of good people doing really messed up stuff. I grew up in a household that was very sexist. My father would say things like, the best place for a woman is in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant. And he would say things like that and other things. You can't tell me those kinds of experiences don't have an impact on my everyday living. It's something I have to constantly fight. Even though I was raised by a single mother who taught me certain things, I had another message that was to the contrary. And so I give that as an example because the racism that we're talking about is not that stuff that we saw in Charlottesville or the stuff that people are really worried about because of recent events. It's that subtle stuff. It's the stuff that we don't think about. It's the little comments. It's the deaths by 1,000 cuts that men, women, people from different racial backgrounds experience day in and day out. And so the first thing an institution will look for is the data. What is the data telling me? The data is telling me we have a disparity in our graduation rates. We have a disparity in how our discipline is being handed out. And then the question is, where is it coming from? I don't need to wait to ask the teacher, are you racist? What I'm seeing are numbers that are showing me that there's something wrong in the system. My job is to figure out how do I prepare my staff, my students, the community, so those numbers are not like that over the long run. That we see a reduction in the disciplinary referrals, and we see a reduction in disparity on race when it comes to graduation. Or we see the number of violations for DWIs and stuff like that change. And that's how you see it. So this shouldn't be a debate about does racism exist in our organizations and institutions. It's about the data showing us that and then going backwards and looking for ways to remedy those challenges.
So I want to jump in and just address a nuance in the gentleman's question about having to address the sins of the past. About having to address the sins of the past. I'm getting a signal about volume. I think that part of what we have to acknowledge is that we have a residue, a hangover, right, of what was probably more brutally and explicitly implemented in the past that we are still coming out of. Right? I'll give you an example outside of education is that the way that the insurance system came to be in our country is because people who were slave owners sought to have insurance over their slaves, right, for their slaves, which were a asset, which were a commodity. And so today, our system, we still get our insurance through our employers. Not everybody, right? But in large part, that is the system that we have, and we are coming out of that, certainly, right? But that is an example of how there is something residual, right, still left behind that we are still trying to come out of today. And I'm glad you said not everybody, because yeah, I mean, some are not being provided for, and we're trying to make our way out of that. So when we take that same sort of example across all sort of sectors, we see that hangover, and we see that residual. And because of that insidious nature, that non-overt nature of racism, we have to, in everything that we shape, do an analysis of whether we're perpetuating some of that residual or inadvertently putting into place something that's going to have an effect that was unintended. And much of that is because as human beings we're like, oh, what if we do that last time? Let's kind of build off of that and build off of that and build off of that. And so we haven't resolved to systemically do things differently, right? We're building off of that residual, and we have the effects of that in our institutions, right? So I have not personally sat down to do the analysis on the bond, but I encourage it as a part of the journey that everybody sits down and do the analysis of the bond, and to think about those questions, and to think about that residual, right? As I was saying, we get rewarded for the transactional. Well, if I just do this, the state will give me money, or I will have a match, or whatever. Wait a second, what exactly am I doing here? What exactly are we as a system doing here, and what are we perpetuating, right? It's a call to a lens on all of those things.
It's nice being a moderator here when you don't have to pull comments out of the panel. That's not this panel. We got to move on to the next question, and the next question has to come from this side of the room.
All right. Dr. Cruz, I have a question. You mentioned AP and the gifted program. Okay. Now, I hear in Europe they start teaching algebra in the 5th and 6th grades. And as a substitute teacher, I believe that most 5th and 6th graders can start learning algebra. Why don't we do that here?
They do.
No. I mean, for everybody, not just for a few select, but as a routine policy.
Absolutely. Actually, and we do. So there are algebra concepts that begin in elementary school. Algebra as a class can begin in 7th grade, and we have that across in all of our campuses. So again, when we look at algebra, or let's just look at advanced courses in math, those are things that can be done across the board, and making sure that even go to a bigger extent, even around college readiness. So we go to, like any of our school districts, you can go to AISD, Maynard, Del Valle, Round Rock, Leander, you will find students in middle school beginning to take Algebra 1. But it's more than that. It's around college readiness. So as an example, but I can use this, and I'm going to try to always not go deep on just AISD, a topic I love to talk about, but I'm going to go around other districts as well, because it's a new concept that we've actually opened up, and those are around early college high schools. That's not mandated by the state. And in early college high schools, kids can start taking college courses as freshmen. They have to meet the standard to take those courses, and they do. And in 4 years, students can earn a high school diploma and up to 60 college credits. So they earn an associate's degree and a high school diploma. Actually, for us, students actually earn their associate's degree in May, because ACC ends their classes in May, and then they actually earn their high school diploma the next 2 weeks. So it's just something that really happens. And where did we start that in AISD? We actually started that at Reagan and LBJ, 2 schools that were actually going to be closed by the state because of performance. So not only did AISD say, you know what, these schools aren't going to close, we're actually going to turn the system on its head and say, these kids, we know they can take college courses. And they have. We've had now 2, maybe 3 graduating classes from early college high schools. Why did we choose Reagan and LBJ? Well, one is because they were set for closure by the state. They have met all state performance standards. Reagan had 800 students at one time. Now they have 1,300. The students did not transfer out of the school. And with that, then, we've now opened up 6 early college high schools across the district. Every one of those high schools is a Title I campus, which is a high level of poverty. So LBJ Reagan would have around 85 to 90% poverty within those schools. The others are now Eastside Memorial, Crockett High School, Travis High School, and also Lanier. Lanier is right off of Runberg Lane. So of our 11 comprehensive, we have 17 high schools in AISD. 6 of them are now early college high schools, where students earn college credit, have to meet all the standards to actually get into college. There's no watering down, because I get that sometimes, right? Well, it's watered down. No, it's not. You know, but you gotta always push the facts, right? It isn't true. It's easy to say that's just not true. And kids are earning college credit. Not everybody earns 2 years, but they do get some level of college credit. And we pay for it in AISD. Nobody tells us to do it. I say that an example in Austin, but there are other early college high schools now in other Central Texas districts. I know Round Rock has opened one. I believe there are other smaller school systems in the area also opening up early college high schools. Not a requirement, not a state expectation, but it is one way or another way to give kids an equal life chance around education. But I appreciate the question, because it's always have to push ourselves. Kids are ready, we have to provide those opportunities for our students.
Thank you, good answer.
As someone currently paying college tuition for a daughter, I think that's a wonderful idea. Anything else? Okay, this one goes to the back of the room. Let's do the woman in the green shirt there.
My name is Donna Hoffman. I'm a former teacher at LBJ High School and Austin partner in education with nonprofit Black Shear Bridge since 2011. I'm very proud of the East Austin schools. The kids are all right. I saw that poster up there, but from the hood, the kids are all right. And that has been really on my mind, so I was like shocked to see it this morning, because people think that the schools aren't good in the east side, and they are good, and the kids are all right. And the 5 schools in the east side that are proposed for closure by the list and the facilities master plan associated with the bond are all meeting academic standards. They're under enrolled. But what is the district doing to promote enrollments? And why is the district blaming these schools for low enrollments when families have been displaced? And yet some of the white families are coming into Blackshear because the school district has promoted Blackshear, and there's integration happening in Blackshear. Those three schools and the 2 up north, Brook, Metz, Sanchez, Norman, Burke, Sadler, Means, are proposed for closure, and that's why I've joined a political action committee for the first time in my life, and I'm saying save East Austin schools by voting against this bond and coming back a year or 2 from now when we can get the facilities master plan right and not bump East Side Memorial High School kids out for loss of
I
Okay,
would
thank you.
appreciate if we not talk about whether we're going to support an issue or not support an issue until we have a panel discussion about that issue, because otherwise it's a terrible bias.
Thank you.
Okay. You know, I believe in all of our schools as well. Every single one. For us, that's 130 of our campuses across our district. We also have to look at where is it that we're actually going to build brand new or fully modernized campuses. Those are 16 across the entire district. That's an important data point. When we look at, should we actually just sort of patch up a school, which are on the east side, the west side, and all over. And I will also say that I-35 is no longer, not for the district. City may be something different, but that's not a differentiation for us as poverty. We have Webb Middle School, west of 35, has over 90% poverty. I mentioned Travis High School is west of 35, that's gonna have 90% poverty. I don't really use that. Maybe I did, maybe in the 80s, because I've lived here off and on since the 80s or so. That may have been one. I don't think that's the reality today. There are differences. At Lanier High School, another campus, at Early College High School, 90% poverty, well into I-35, well west of 35 off of Runberg Lane. So I think it's important to sort of, when we look at these issues and say, well, what's really happening in the district? How are things changing? And what are these opportunities to provide all kids with an equal life chance? As far as, you know, buildings and things like that, what is it that's being done in these areas? So that we actually then look at performance, but if it's a facility condition, we're using consistent criteria across the board. I just as important, you know, what are really the facts out there, not perhaps a belief or, and I think, which I have to respect beliefs and, you know, history, we have to respect what's happened, but what about the future? And in this report, it's about, so what's gonna happen today to change things in the future? What's that gonna be? And around multiple areas. That's just another, I think, issue that we always have to sort of bring back to see how is it gonna be done across the Austin community, and also in Central Texas.
So, yeah, so I'm going to dovetail on your question for just a minute. There was an interesting article in, I want to say it was either The Atlantic or Mother Jones, that highlighted the Philadelphia school system, which is where I come from, And the number of schools that they had to close, and the reason that they had to close them was because they were supposed to have X number of students, and they had X minus 250 students, right? So that there weren't enough students there in order to keep a school open, because it was expensive, right? So I think that that's part of her question is, with some of these schools, because of the movement of families and so forth, that they're under-enrolled. So the question really that I'd like to pursue a little bit is, how do you market an under-enrolled school, right?
Right, so actually the district did undergo a marketing plan. So one is about a marketing plan and also changing policies. So within the school district, we actually did change 2 policies. So we said if you teach or work in Austin ISD, your child can attend any one of our schools, even if it's already over-enrolled, you can send them there. We also said if you live outside of Austin ISD, but you want your child to enroll in AISD, you can also do that. That made a significant impact on enrollment. We did not say it can only be this school or the other. We gave it out as choice to families. Because if you work in this part of the city and you can take your child to this particular school, we just open it up. We did not target any one area, because I think to then target it again, it's sort of limiting that opportunity. So for us, we said 2 things. An employee, they can go anywhere. If you're coming outside the district, they can attend a school that is not over-enrolled. That's the only differentiator that we said. We saw students enroll across the district, across the board, in multiple campuses. Within that 1 year, there were 1,400 students enrolled who actually chose that, through that policy, actually enrolled kids in our school district. There's another thing when we look at institutional sort of issues. Said we're 60% poverty. We're also the highest payer into recapture as a district in the state of Texas.
Right.
Last year, we gave this to the state of Texas over $400 million. This year, we are set to send to the state over $530 million of Austin's tax base, and we're 60% poverty. And I mentioned multiple schools that have 90% poverty or more. That's another sort of issue that our local delegation deals with at the legislative level to make a difference there. Those are different things that are impacting where kids live, and what does that go back to? I'm a teacher, right? So I'll ask a question. What do you think is one of those factors as far as that's impacting our enrollment and how much we send under recapture? Housing, affordability. Remember I said, as the city changes, Austin ISD is going to change. That it's true, and sometimes I know people don't want me to say it or whatever. I mean, I understand that, but that is what's happening. And so when we offer these different opportunities, it's got to be different of some schools marketing and saying yes, you can enroll, but what we're seeing is there aren't students in that assignment area anymore to fill up that school. In some situations, it's a small school with a small enrollment, but it pretty much fills up the school. In other situations, there's a school of 950 students with 450 enrolled. And then I have another school of 1,300, or I have another school of 1,100. So it's really across the board when we look at these types of opportunities. We are doing different things. At Wynn, with the low enrollment, we're bringing in Montessori, our first Montessori school. I mentioned now 6 early college high schools across our district. We're also bringing in at Covington a dyslexia project. They're really honed in on the science behind reading and fluency and comprehension. So just this year alone, continuing on with one-way dual language, two-way dual language, early college high schools, fine arts academies, a Montessori school, a dyslexia project at middle school. There are more projects slated for the future to offer these opportunities to our students across the board. When we look at equity, when we look at this, we also look at students who have special needs. That's also important, which we're changing something here within Rosedale School, an area right in this community.
Somebody up in front. Let's go.
Well, since you just brought this up, I'm wondering what the 530 million or billion, whatever it was.
Million.
Beyond me. Going to the state, how are you affording to do all these marvelous things?
Well, we still come into our own budget. As far as facilities and anything that's created or any revenue that comes in through a bond, all that money, thanks for asking that, because I should have said that in my mind and I didn't quite get to that one. All that money stays in Austin. So all the money raised in a bond is not subject to recapture and then going to the state. So thank you for asking me that question. It all is gonna stay here in Austin, and it's invested in Austin. The reason why we chose this, because if we go towards this other type of funding, and you raise that tax rate, that's subject to recapture. So for us, why would we do that when we're not gonna keep all of it? Let's put it into what's debt side, and for facility use. The other things, we're actually restructuring programs and say, well, we've done this program for several years. That also brings in issues like, well, we've always done it. I understand, I get it, it wasn't the best thing. Is there a different way to have, we've never had a dyslexia project. We've never had a certified language academic therapist in all of our elementary schools. We've never done that. And now we do, as a full-time person, a full-time teacher there. And all those change pieces are hard. It is what it is. But it is about reflecting on, can we invest resources in a better way? And that's where these other programs come in. And we're actually even redoing the way we finance some things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to the woman on the aisle right here on this side of the room.
I want to thank all the panel for what you're saying and encouraging us to dig deep. My question is for Dr. Cruz again. So our district is really, really segregated. Most of our black and brown students go to high poverty schools where 75% or more of the students on those campuses receive free and reduced lunch, and the vast majority of white students go to low poverty schools where 0 to 25% of the campus receives free and reduced lunch. So I know that you're looking into, maybe there's a task force about looking at integrating District 1 schools,
right,
or maybe going, but it's hard to integrate District 1 with the majority of those schools are majority black and brown students and majority free and reduced lunch. And I really think that it's good for all of our children to go to schools. I'm lucky that my kids go to Ann Richards and Pillow, both integrated schools. If all of our kids go to integrated schools. So I'm wanting to know what you're going to do to address this issue, and also what you need from the public, because I know it's really difficult to push something like this if there's outcry from the community. So what can I do as well?
Yeah, you know, these are challenging. I love the questions because they truly get to the heart of the issues.
Yeah.
And along this, it's and I appreciate too that you're saying, so what can I do with this? Because you know, those choices for parents already exist. It's a diversity choice policy. Majority, minority, it already does exist.
But those parents have to drive themselves.
Not under diversity choice. So under majority, minority, parents, you do have to provide transportation. Now ASD, we do bus 23,000 students to school every day. And it's an investment of $28 million. And we do not get a single dollar from the state for transportation. So that's a local investment because it fits with the DNA of Austin, and we believe in that. Providing, it takes money to get around the city, so we all know that too, right? So there's a diversity choice policy where in certain neighborhoods, because certain parts of the city and throughout the city, students can then choose to go to another school. Those are schools already predetermined, and we do provide transportation. Some parents elect that choice and some do not. But that policy does already exist around diversity choice. Other opportunities, such as you mentioned, Ann Richards. Ann Richards is a school that mirrors the district demographics. It does. Many times I hear people say, you know, it doesn't. I mean, it does. We do provide transportation to Ann Richards. Part of the bond is creating a new school in District 1, a middle school, and we create that as an integrated school. So we're actually going to be having a little bit more discussion around in the planning team on the programs and the opportunities on integrating and beginning now with other schools that have done that successfully over time. And there are other school examples. I can think of Sunset Valley is another. You mentioned Pillow. Very much where those also are neighborhood schools, I will also say. I mean, so when the neighborhood, the way it represents, it's going to represent that school. But District 1 is a different way to look at these opportunities as far as integration and, but actually building it from the ground up. Ann Richards was one school. It's a school of choice. It was built from the ground up, not literally, but its policies about kids of poverty and demographics was actually purposely done in the way it is, and it's been phenomenally successful. That school within, you know, it's been around now 10 years, but from the last 2 years, it's actually one of the top schools in the state and the country, based on Newsweek and the newest World Report.
Anybody want to let Dr. Cruz rest his voice and address that?
Y'all can share the love a little bit. Cause they're gonna get after me later on. I'm not hogging this thing, right?
I want to add one comment. One of the things that be mindful of, and I think Dr. Cruz has been really supportive of, is in collaboration with the city. And because a lot of the things that we're talking about, you can't force people to live in certain places of the city. One of the problems we had in the past in our city of Austin is trying to bus people from one side of town to another side of town, and nobody wants to do that. The real issue is how do you bring high quality educational experiences regardless of where you live in the city. So when you look at Blackshear Elementary, you look at Campbell Elementary, you look at what they're trying to do at Wynn, LBJ, what they have done is transform the school, had a philosophical debate within the organization and said, how can we change these schools to meet the needs of the community? So this is me personally, this is not about getting brown and black and white kids together. Because the assumption was, if we get more white kids over here, things are going to be better for everyone. That's not, no. One, we know that's not true, and that's not the goal. The goal is to change the quality of the teachers, the philosophy, the model that you have at the schools to improve the community. And so when we talk about in the city, our role is to figure out, when the mayor talks about supporting education is the best pipeline to prosperity. If we have better schools, people have better jobs, they can buy the house they want, live in the community they come from, versus the challenges that we're having now with gentrification. You know, when I bought my house when I first came to Austin, it was, people looked at me weird because I was a black person who wanted to live in East Austin. Like, I was coming to East Austin. Like, somehow it was weird. I should be going to West Austin. And I'm like, no, I want to come because this is my community, this is where I want to be. And I was highly involved with Keeling, for good or for bad, in my kids' middle school. But there's that level of investment from families and communities and partnering with people. That's how you make schools better. And I think what Dr. Cruz is doing, and you see this in other school districts as well, is bringing all those resources together, seeing those partnerships come together, avoiding the silos that we tend to run into. That's how you make schools better. When you get folks like you involved in the schools, it makes schools better. And I think that's the direction that we've been trying to take when we talk about Spirit of East Austin, the Task Force on Institutional Racism. We talk about place-based communities when we try to talk, how we talk about complete communities. Because if I'm low income and I need to get my kid to the doctor, but the doctor I go to is on the other side of the town, and I don't have a car, so I gotta take me and my kids. We gotta go to the other side. I now have taken an entire day just to go to the doctor, and now they're not getting instruction. The kids are now behind. So how do we plan things so you have health services at the schools in ways that there's not the issue around transportation? How do we make sure our transportation system meets the needs of our community? One of my biggest beefs coming from living in the East Coast is I like to be on the bus and not be sitting in the sun for 40 minutes. You know, these are the kind of things that people are worried about when you think about getting around. So that's why when we look at the task force, we look at the Spirit of East Austin, we look at these multiple issues because they interact with one another. And if you don't have them interacting with one another, you're going to find out things fall off. You have certain problems. You're going to have people talking to each other. And you find out we're having the same kinds of problems over and over. And so I think part of Dr. Cruz's goal is, and is working in collaboration with other entities to try to support what he's trying to do. And so I would ask you to think about how not just what you can do, but how the city can support what the school's trying to do. How do we get the libraries in collaboration with them? There's a lot of opportunities for collaboration that we sometimes miss.
Have their hands up forever.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I have a two-part, well, actually I have a one-part question for Dr. Cruz, I'm sorry. And then I'm going to throw out a little bit of data from the bond as well. My name is Monica Sanchez, and what I want to mention is that there's about $680 million that's been allocated through the bond to West Austin, and about $330 million allocated to East Austin. When you talk about the schools that are under-enrolled in East Austin, you also need to mention that Crockett Vertical Team is under-enrolled by 2,100 students, and Covington Middle School is under-enrolled or at 55% capacity, which means that it's under-enrolled by 45%. But yet the conversation has revolved around the East Austin schools. So how can you justify looking only at East Austin when in reality that we do have 7,000 seats that are not currently filled across the district? And like I mentioned, 2,100 of those come out of the Crockett Vertical Team.
Sure. So as far as, if we look at the East and West, let me, continue on that one with Monica's question. So when we look at East and West, what's the per pupil expenditure in the bond? It's actually around $13,000 for students on east of 35 and $11,000 for students. But remember, I'm using the data point, just to match Monica's data point. But remember, I also said high poverty throughout. So one person has actually the highest level of poverty compared to many of the schools. And almost every school there, other than but it does include me, Thompson, Barrington, T.A. Brown, Webb, Lanier. All these schools, Cook, are right there west of 35. So I have to look at things differently. We do look at East and West. And that's why I do that, because I've heard that, the data point about East and West. So I say, well, I told them to just look at it. So what is it? So that's what the investment is in a bond for east of 35 at $13,000 a student. West of 35 is less at $11,000 a student. We also have many more students enrolled in schools west of 35 than east of 35. And when you see demographic changes, some of that's going on sort of in the urban core, there's a really good video on our website that actually Ryan Robinson with the City of Austin, we don't actually make these decisions in a vacuum. He actually put out a video talking about Austin's demographic changes, and then actually mentions AISD specifically on the work that has been going on for several years to try to keep students in our district, period. Because when we look at it, when the city looked at it, poverty rates, many individual families of poverty were moving to outside Austin areas. I know that data point because he's the one who shared that with me. And I thought, here we had to change our strategy how to keep kids in. That's why that policy that I said, where we're letting kids outside the district enroll, we never done that before. Actually, we did, but you have to pay tuition. So if you're a family of poverty, you have to pay tuition. Nobody took that option. That's actually why I changed that policy. To say, well, if you're still going to work here, or to keep families consistent because you love your school, but maybe Austin you can't afford it anymore, you can still have your kids enroll in our schools. And that was one policy decision that the board actually approved unanimously to make those types of changes. Those other policies we still have in place, majority and minority, are still there. That hasn't been removed. Diversity choice, I do think that maybe looking at a group, whether we include Donna with her focus areas, or maybe Monica, or just other folks in the room, we've all become very good friends recently, where we can look at maybe some of the existing policies and see how we can actually then make them even stronger. Make these policies even stronger. Because go back to what Kazike said, if it's forced, I don't know that's not a choice anymore. And I do know that families do want choice, as they wanted choice in programming. That's why I do think it's very complex, very, very complex, when we look at some of these long-term efforts to change the way we do things in the school system.
I want to make sure people understand the level of interest in this general topic. There are people outside the door in the hallway who have been trying to listen to this entire meeting. And just to go to extreme geographic diversity, is there anyone out there in the hallway who has a question? There is. Come on in.
I do. As Dr. Cruz says, this east-west dichotomy is actually false, and this 13,000 versus 11,000 number is kind of meaningless. Do we have the numbers that are more meaningful? In other words, do we have the number of how much we're spending per student from the areas that are actually high poverty areas?
We do. Now, the question was about the bond. And so that's where that number is.
And
right?
in the context of the bond.
Right. Your question is about a per pupil expenditure, right?
In the context of the bond.
But that is that number.
Okay.
That is the number I just said. I thought you meant, like, what is it cost to operate a school of a Title I school, or east side or west side of 35? I don't have that number with me.
I think what she's getting at is the crescent, right? We often describe and also programming gets funded based on this crescent of poverty that goes from Rutland right across the east and then down south.
Right, all the way to Dove Springs. Because Dove Springs is also East Austin, right? So there's also Dove Springs. And maybe I can follow up, because if I didn't that's the number I have in my mind as far as what the bond, and maybe I can follow up afterwards.
We're gonna have some time to follow up afterwards, go into details. We're not gonna go all the way to 4 o'clock, we'll end early so other people can go. Let's go to the other extreme, geographic diversity.
I want to change the subject slightly because we haven't talked about housing.
Exactly.
And so let me give you a little background because to me it's very complex. I live near Tech Ridge, so racially the area I live in is very diverse. I mean, enormously diverse beyond just, Latino, Black, international. But there's also a very consistent economic and education level because of where I live. And my question with the housing is, how are you going to, number one, address the issue of housing in Austin being expensive? How do these people at the lower economic level get to housing? And is there any effort in your housing at looking at integrating economic levels? And the reason I ask that is because to me, the more you learn about the people that are not like you, the more you understand their issues, their difficulties, and then the more everybody can help each other. So what is going on with the housing thing?
Housing affordability and economic segregation.
Basically, she's asking, what's the question? What are some things that are going around housing? And what I wanted to do is, for folks who haven't actually pulled out the report, I don't know about you, but it's part of my weekend leisure reading. But the second chapter focuses on housing. I just want to highlight the kind of areas around housing. One's about affordable housing, find it to create it, fair housing and the right to choose, rental housing, the right to stay, ensure affordability in high occupancy areas, community empowerment and city accountability. I just highlight that because it gives you some kind of broad overview of what's in the actual report and what's talked about. But more specifically, one of the challenges is that I think we're experiencing in our city is that, and particularly when I think about East Austin, and be real clear, we also think about the Eastern Crescent, from North Austin going across East Austin down south. But one of the challenges that when you make an area like East Austin, I live in East Austin most of my time here in the city. You do things that are pretty much attractive to a lot of people. I mean, you go to East Austin, and if you like to bike like me, you see all the nice little bike lanes. You go, oh, okay, that makes it. That's for me, right? You see food like Eastside pies. You say, oh, that's for me. You see the recreational other activities, the swimming pool over at Rosewood. Oh, that's for me. And so why wouldn't someone like me find that attractive? And someone like me may not be of the same racial background. There are a lot of people are going to find East Austin attractive. But one of the challenges is if I come from a background where maybe I can't traditionally afford that, what is the city's responsibility as government to make that available to folks who otherwise can't afford it? Yeah. Because if someone takes a house that was, let's say, $150,000 and waited 10 years and now it's half a lot more money. I don't want to put the essence of it, but it's a lot more money. But for someone who's not even say I wouldn't say working class, because when people say working class, they think someone. I think a lot of teachers oftentimes are working class when you look about the kind of money that they're making. How can someone like that workforce housing that we oftentimes talk about in City Hall, how can you create that in East Austin and other parts of the city? Because it's not just East Austin, it's across the entire city. The way that you treat, the mayor's talked about, he's talked about having a strike fund where you look at these housing that's called like Class B and C housing that's across the city that's already been bought up to a certain degree. And when that's happened, what has happened? They build it up, they make it look real nice, and they triple the rents, right? If there's a strike fund, the idea behind it is that we buy those Class C and B rental properties around the main thoroughfare corridors in the city, and you buy them up, and you yes, you make them look nicer, but you make sure they're available for our working class families. And one of the things I've talked about, and this is just me, that you can't just say, hey, we have nice housing for you. You have to be purposeful going to your communities of color who oftentimes are neglected, and say, hey, these places are available. Now you can't be racist and say, okay, yeah, these are for the black folks, like they did back in the with the public housing. Remember Roosevelt for the blacks, and I forget the one Santa Rita was for Latinos. You can't do that, but you can be purposeful of saying, hey, communities, this is the housing that's been created. Could you afford this? Would you like to live over here? And what we found out when you asked Eric Tang, a lot of folks who've left this city would like to come back. They still have roots here. They still go to church here. They still eat at restaurants here. They visit their families here. And so even though folks have left to go to Manor and Del Valle and Round Rock and Pflugerville, a lot of those folks still have their roots and are here every day of the week, whether it be for work, recreation, other activities. What they're looking for is opportunities so I can live in the city and actually afford it. And that's one of the biggest challenges. So there's a strike fund. There's just different ideas that have been put out there about looking at the part of the city. We can't rely on the market by itself to provide for affordable housing.
What is a strike fund?
Well, I just described. It's a funding that's going, I'm not sure what more to say about.
It's the idea to have a pot of money that can assist to help keep these things affordable.
So where would the money, where would the funds?
So let's talk about the problem with where would the funds come from.
Right.
So part of the problem is that we have many ideas of the types of tools, but they all take money, right? And so this is where I would ask you to be actionable with us. During the special session this season of the state ledge, the city was under battle in regard to some of the tools that it could and couldn't use regarding how we create pots of money to actually do many of the recommendations that are in the report. That is an ongoing battle that we do need your help with, right? The city does have a team of policy people that works representing the city at the state ledge, but we need a lot more pressure there, public pressure there, that only the public and community can bring in order to change the status quo that's going on there, because we are subject to a greater system, right, that is making things very difficult for us to create those pots of money in order to do that. But let me talk about the city's money and where it's investing its money. The public safety part of the budget has taken up to 69.9%, has grown to 69.9% in the last couple of years. And this year it's proposed to take up 65.5% of the budget. That's police, fire, and EMS. So in this council, I think this council has been recently showing a willingness to examine what is going on with that, because that means that 30%, that other 30% of funding out of the $3.9 billion budget of the city has to make do for all other city services, including anything that would go toward these solutions around housing. So several council members have individually, and you all know we have quorum, so we can't all talk to each other in terms of the staff and council. We have to respect those rules of quorum. But we are seeing that individual council members and groups of council members are taking a really close look at that. The spend around public safety is largely driven and determined by a negotiations process around contracts with the public safety unions. And that is a right given to them by a state statute, Statute 143, if you want to dig into it. And so they have a right to negotiate that. And so this exists not only here in Texas, it exists in other states. And so the union has a right to sit down. And so across time, when they start those negotiations, they don't start from zero. We wish they did zero-based budgeting with these contracts, which means that we wish we started back at zero. Oh, what do we need? No, it starts at the spend from last time. And so the negotiation happens in such a way that it's like, well, what are we going to want to get, and et cetera. It's quite complicated. But what I'm getting at is that right now, those public, safety contracts are being, negotiated. And those negotiations are open to the public, and you can attend them to better understand what's driving. And I know that this group and our, people across the city are smart enough to understand, if they dig in, to understand what's driving those things. But we have to take a look at that. At the same time, we hear from all sorts of parts of the city that maybe there's not a satisfaction with those types of services. So there's a deeper level, story. There's a deeper level subplot for all of us to dig into, because the way that we've been doing business has gotten us to that 70% of 3.9 billion being spent on that, leaving not a whole lot of money for everything from, you know, our public library system, parks, all the way through whatever we need for housing. So those are the sorts of structural residuals that we have to examine when we think about, well, how can we create those pots of money? We wish that we had just, hey, here it is. But actually there's some structural nuances that we are dealing with, that we have to look at together, and organize around together, and push our elected officials to have the courage to do that, because it's not an easy thing to do either. So I hope that you look into those couple of things, because many of the possibilities lie there, but there's a lot of hands tied there still.
So I've noticed this strange phenomenon that the number of people raising their hands with questions keeps increasing as we go along. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get to everyone, and we always like to leave time at the end for people to come up and talk to individual panel members. So I'm going to ask if we have one final question.
So I have one clarification question, because Alba mentioned something that was new to me, and that was housing blueprint. And my question is, what's the relationship between the housing blueprint and Code Next?
Yeah, there's a blueprint, which is a plan, and then there's a Code Next, which is not enforced. It's something that's being developed as we speak. The draft is about to come out, if I'm not mistaken, for some type of permanent code for next year, because there's a lot of concerns, and I'll speak from just what I've heard from different folks. So that's not my area. But one of the things I hear is that if you're a person trying to build homes in Austin, the time that it takes to get through the permitting process and all the rules and regulations increases the cost of housing. And so the code, in part, the rewrite of this code is in some ways an attempt to deal with remedy some of the challenges that we're experiencing. What I think what they're doing in the city now is trying to get community input about what should be in the code currently that's not in there, so it's improved to deal with some of the major issues that I think we're all concerned about, particularly around affordability. So there are two different areas.
So what's the housing blueprint, though?
The blueprint is it's like a housing plan. I mean, they're using blueprint. Well, I don't know. I forget the debate about blueprint versus plan.
They had a big debate about that.
Yeah.
But it is, I guess they chose to name it a blueprint, and I'm certainly not saying roadmap, but semantics, right? So it is a conglomeration of strategies around affordability in housing, whereas Code Next is the process to get a rewrite of the land code. The land code is what it's not code as in you're out of code because you built this. It's not. It is related to that though, because it talks about what you can build and where and how you can build it. Across the decades, it became extremely complicated because it was just patchwork of different things coming in. And so it has become so complex that it's just really not working anymore. So the city took on the project of Code Next, which I understand there are people who are deep in the weeds of it who are going to come talk to you about that next year, but next month, right? But hopefully not next year. But that is in essence what it is. The housing department of the city has to do both an annual planning process and a longer term planning process. And so that blueprint was part of that planning process. And like I said earlier, the timing was very good in terms of this because That was developed by the housing department. This was developed by a broader cross-section of community, and so some of those things were able to come into that housing blueprint. And Code Next is definitely something that you should watch closely. Many of you probably already are. And to think about this because it does affect affordability. It is very complex, and it does have to do with these issues as well.
So the only other thing that I'll suggest is that you guys did a wonderful job in 6 months. I hope that Congress has a 6-month deadline. Let's hope that they can do what you've done here.
And I hope your car is still there when you leave. I also want to thank everyone. There's many things to do in Austin. You all chose to be here.